Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, December 27th, 2022. All right, I hope everybody had a good weekend. And for those who celebrate, hope you had a good Christmas. We have a lot of stuff to go over today. Some news piled up over these past few days while I was off. So let's try to get through it. And the first story at the top of antiwar.com today is a big one, and it's a report from an investigative journalist named Jack Murphy. And this report says that the CIA is directing sabotage attacks inside Russia. Now, when I first saw this report, it was published on Murphy's personal website, and I wasn't too familiar with him. This is a pretty huge allegation being made in this report. But I spoke with Scott Horton about it and a few other people that I trust and said that he is, a good source. And I looked into some of his older work. He's done a lot of good work on U.S. drone strikes in Afghanistan and U.S. involvement in Syria. So, you know, I can't think of a reason why he would make this up. He's a bit of an insider. He was he was in U.S. Special Operations Forces. So he's a former Special Operations guy. But anyway, so I'm going to try to get through this. His report is very thorough and very detailed. If you want to go check it out, I linked to it here. But this is a good quick summary of it from me. So the CIA has been using a European NATO country's intelligence services to conduct sabotage attacks inside Russia since the February invasion of Ukraine. And this was according to Murphy's report, and he cited unnamed former U.S. intelligence and military officials. The report said that no U.S. personnel are on the ground in Russia, but that the operations are being directed by the CIA. The U.S. is using an ally's intelligence services to add an extra layer of plausible deniability. A former U.S. Special Operations official told Murphy that this layer of plausible deniability was a major factor in President Biden signing off on these attacks. Murphy said that he didn't name the NATO country in his report, so we could only guess. It's a European NATO country, and he didn't name them because he believed doing so might endanger the operational security of cells that are still operational inside Russia. So again, it appeared on his personal website, and it looks like he tried to get this published in a mainstream news outlet, but he ran into a few issues. He put a note at the end of his piece that said, that explained it a little bit. He wrote, quote, "While working with editors at mainstream publications, I was asked to do things that were illegal and unethical in one instance, and in another instance, I felt that a senior CIA official was able to edit my article by making off the record statements." And end quote. So it sounds like there were some forces working against him that didn't want this published in the mainstream media. So according to the report, the covert campaign inside Russia has been years in the making. Two former military officials said that the NATO country's spy services had hidden a cache of explosives and equipment inside Russia more than a decade ago, and that some of this gear has been used in recent sabotage operations. So more than a decade ago, that puts the timeline before the 2014 ousting of Viktor Yanukovych, when things really changed. The U.S. backed the coup there. Russia took Crimea. Separatists in the Donbass declared independence, sparking the war there. That was the big turning point. But this is saying that they were placing weapons inside Russia over 10 years ago. So according to some of Murphy's sources, the CIA, they didn't get involved until 2014, after those events I just mentioned. And the first time that sleeper cells entered Russia that were directed by the CIA was in 2016. 2016, so this is a while ago. And more people entered the country in the following years. So the NATO ally whose intelligence services is doing this, they provided the undercover operatives with backstories to explain their presence in Russia and documents to back them up. The CIA was aware of this. The report said that around the time Russia invaded on February 24th, the NATO allies' spy service activated its sleeper cells inside Russia using covert communication, and that they were ready for orders on what targets to strike. So it's not clear how many attacks that these sleeper cells have been responsible for, but there has been a series of mysterious explosions at Russian military facilities, power plants, and railways since the invasion. Some of them are Ukrainian shelling and drone attacks, but this report is suggesting that some maybe industrial fires could have been sabotaged. There's always a chance that some of these former officials might want to be exaggerating it to make it sound like that the U.S. has more reach in Russia than it really does. But one of the attacks that this report just really suggested that these saboteurs could have been behind was a fire in April at the Research Institute of Russia's Aerospace Defense Forces. That killed over 20 people, according to Russian media. That's pretty significant. So the sabotage operations, any kind of covert operations like this, they require a thing called a presidential finding, so something that the president signs off on. So President Obama, and this is mentioned in the report, he signed a finding before he left office that allowed covert action against Russia over allegations that Moscow interfered in the 2016 election. And that claim has never been proven. You have to define election interference. But anyway, that's a whole nother can of worms. But I linked to an article there that explains how that allegation has never really been proven. But it is amazing because this is suggesting that Russiagate is being used to justify, CIA directed attacks inside Russia. And according to the Washington Post, this is from a report back in 2017, Obama's finding allowed the planting of cyber weapons in Russia's infrastructure. And Murphy cited a former CIA official who said the finding also allowed sabotage operations against Russia. So again, Russiagate being used to justify these attacks. But he did also say that other former U.S. officials believe that in order to carry out these current sabotage operations, it would have required an amendment to previous findings or a new one. So they're not so sure that it was that finding Obama signed. But I mean, it really is something if that is the case. So a CIA spokesperson denied the allegations made in the report, but Murphy pointed out that the spy agency can legally deny the existence of its covert operations under U.S. law. The CIA directing these attacks, of course, risks a major escalation between NATO and Russia, and it could lead to a nuclear escalation. This is how serious that this is. And in his note at the end of the report, Murphy said that he published the story so the public would be informed about these undercover operations. His point being that the Russian government knows what's going on here. They're aware of who's sponsoring these sabotage strikes. And he says the intelligence community wants Russia to know, and that the only party left in the dark is the public, unaware of this. And, it's just such a huge risk that Americans, of course, have the need to know what their government is doing inside Russia. So this is very serious. And he said the article went through a vigorous fact-checking process and was deemed as newsworthy as the secret bombing campaigns of Laos and Cambodia during the war in Vietnam, and the CIA's secret drone campaign inside Pakistan, which was much more recent. So that's how serious this is. And I agree, if this is true, it is as huge as those events that the U.S. that Biden would be signing off on something like this that risks so much. So go check out the report. If you want to read his whole write-up there, it's very detailed, and come away with your own conclusions about it. But I think it was worth sharing. And I saw him on Twitter making a point saying, in a few months, the New York Times, or in a few years, the New York Times is going to be reporting something like this. But anyway, so the next article here, the Ukraine's foreign minister says that there will be no talks with Russia until after a war crimes tribunal. So this is Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, and he told the Associated Press on Monday that Russia must face a tribunal for alleged war crimes in Ukraine before peace talks can be held between Kiev and Moscow. So those are the conditions before talks can even be held. So this is the latest sign that there's no end in sight right now to the fighting in Ukraine. Of of course, Russia's never going to comply with these conditions, and the U.S. is continuing to escalate military aid. The only way Ukraine would change its position, it seems like, is if the U.S. leaned on them to do so, and they're not doing that. And then Putin on Sunday discussed negotiations, and he said that Moscow was ready to negotiate an end to the war, but said that Ukraine and its Western backers were not. So Kuleba said that his country was hoping for a peace summit hosted by the UN to be held soon, but the issue with this peace summit is that Ukrainians don't want Russia to attend. So what are they going to accomplish? And he said, this summit would be held to get these countries on the same page. But again, without Russia, no peace is going to be achieved. And the other Ukrainian demand for talks with Russia is for Russian forces to withdraw from all the territory that they've captured since the invasion. And that's just not a realistic precondition. That's because Putin and other Russian officials have said, that they're going to stay in these areas that they've annexed forever. That's what they say. And, they withdrew from some areas, but for the most part, they're still holding most of the territory that they captured, and they're saying it's part of Russia. And they're saying that Kiev needs to recognize the realities on the ground. So with the two sides just so far apart, again, I know I feel like I'm always writing articles about how there's no chance of peace talks lately, but that's just what it looks like. Okay, so the next article here, another drone attack, Ukrainian drone attack deep inside Russia. So 3 Russian soldiers were killed in a Ukrainian drone attack on the Engels airfield in Russia's Saratov Oblast, and this happened early on Monday morning. This is according to the Russian Defense Ministry. So this airfield is about 300 miles from the Ukrainian border. It's deep inside Russia, and it was targeted by a similar attack earlier this month. I believe it was the same thing. 3 Russian soldiers were killed. And this airbase is said to house, Russian strategic bombers, which is a leg of their nuclear triad. So these could be considered by Russia attacks on their nuclear forces and leaving them, plenty of, that could give them a pretext to use nuclear weapons potentially. It's very concerning. And in the latest attack that took place early Monday morning, Russian officials said that the Ukrainian drone was shot down while it was approaching the airfield, and then 3 troops were killed by the wreckage of the drone. So it's not clear what type of drone was shot down on Monday in the attacks that Ukraine launched earlier this month. Russia said that modified Russian Tu-141 drones were used. And NATO military sources told Asia Times that these drones used U.S. satellite GPS data to hit their targets. That was the ones earlier this month. And this is despite Biden administration claims that the U.S. did not encourage or enable these attacks. So again, this escalation that we're risking, and the Times of London recently reported that the Pentagon now tacitly backs Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. More risk of escalation. So we're just going down a very, very dangerous road here in a lot of different ways. And, it's getting pretty scary, I have to say, just how there's no end in sight to this. But the next one here, this is from the Cradle, and Ukrainian presidential aide calls for the destruction of Iranian weapons factories. So this is Mikhailo Podolyak. He's an aide to Zelensky, and he tweeted on Saturday that, what did he say exactly? He called for the liquidation of Iranian weapons plants over these allegations that they're preparing to sell missiles to Russia. Iran denies that. And when it comes to the drones that Russia is using on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, they're said to be Iranian drones. Iran denies that it's given Russia drones since they launched the invasion. So who knows what the situation is with that. But I believe Ukrainian officials have said this before, basically calling for strikes on Iran for them providing military support. And I mean, it goes to show, how people view other countries to some extent as belligerents for selling weapons to a warring party, let alone giving them, tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons like the U.S. is. Um, so, all right. So the next article here, President Biden, he signed the $858 billion 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. It's the military spending bill for next year. And it's $45 billion more than Biden asked for. Congress gave him a lot more. So he signed this on Friday. And also on Friday, the House passed that huge omnibus bill that's $1.7 trillion. And that includes the funding for the NDAA. But Biden hasn't signed that yet. He did sign a temporary funding bill for the week to avert a government shutdown. And he's expected to sign the omnibus sometime this week. But he still hasn't officially signed it, but he's going to sign it. He said that he would, and it passed through Congress. And again, that omnibus bill, it includes about $45 billion in new aid for Ukraine, bringing total U.S. spending on the war to about $112 billion. And there's also other funding for Ukraine in the NDAA, including $800 million in the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. government to purchase weapons for Kiev. And now this next article here is from Responsible Statecraft, and this is from Ben Freeman and William Hartung. And this article just kind of puts these numbers, these insane numbers of the aid that the U.S. has been giving Ukraine into context. It's more than most U.S. states get every year. I think it's pretty easily at that point now. I just wanted to go through some of the things. So the U.S. has already allocated $68 billion. So the $45 billion will bring it to about $113 billion. So their tally is very close to mine, $113 billion. And to put the amount of U.S. taxpayer money into context, it's more aid than the U.S. has ever supplied to any country in 1 year since at least the Vietnam War. And I believe it's more than the U.S. provided Vietnam, South Vietnam during that time as well. And it's also far more than the $84 billion Russia is expected to spend on its military in 2023. We don't even know if that estimate is right. I've seen that flying around. We know, in 2021, their military budget was about $65 billion. So it's almost twice that what they spent a couple years ago. Now, I'm sure that they're increasing it with the war, but it's just astronomical, these numbers. And it's also nearly as much as the omnibus bill allocates for baseline spending at the State Department. And so between the State Department and the Homeland Security combined, their budgets combined are about 118. Oh, sorry. I just jumbled this all up. But so basically that $113 billion is nearly as much as the baseline spending for the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security. It's almost as much as the $118 billion the United States will spend on medical care for all U.S. military veterans. So again, it's just such an amazing amount of spending. So if Ukraine was an American state, it would rank 11th in terms of the amount of federal funding that it receives, according to government spending data. In other words, in the past 12 months, Ukraine has been awarded more U.S. taxpayer dollars than 40 U.S. states. So it's just pretty significant. All right, the next one here, shifting over to China. So China launched major drills around Taiwan again, and this is in response to new U.S. military aid for Taiwan. So they launched these drills on Sunday, and they said that it was in response to escalating collusion and provocation by the United States and Taiwan. And they called these joint firepower strike drills that they launched in airspace and waters around Taiwan. So here's China's response. That NDAA that President Biden signed, it includes unprecedented military aid for Taiwan that I've been talking about a lot, and I've been talking about it a lot. And the reason why is because of this, is because China is going to view this as a huge provocation. So the Taiwanese Defense Ministry said early Monday that in the previous 24 hours, it detected 71 Chinese warplanes in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, including 43 that crossed the median line, which is an unofficial barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. So this is a pretty significant amount of Chinese military activity around Taiwan, and it looks like it's the largest show of force since Nancy Pelosi visited the island in early August. So the key point here is that it's U.S. support for Taiwan, like Pelosi's visit, which is very big symbolically, and this new military aid that sparks these huge Chinese drills around Taiwan. Very clearly, you know, going to make war more likely what the US is doing here. Um, where was I here? Oh, so before Pelosi's visit, Chinese warplanes rarely crossed the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait. Now they do it almost every day. Um, and Sunday's drills marked the largest Chinese warplane presence in the region since Taiwan's defense ministry began releasing daily reports on Chinese military activity in the region in 2020. A Taiwanese official told Reuters that during the drills, China dispatched warplanes to carry out simulated attacks on Taiwanese and U.S. warships. The official said that Taiwan assessed these exercises were done in response to the new U.S. military aid for Taiwan included in the NDAA. Taiwan is going to receive $2 billion each year through foreign military financing, State Department program that gives governments funding to purchase U.S. arms. And so this aid is a little different than how they usually hand it out. And that's because they're giving Taiwan loans, which means they're going to have to pay it back. Most of this foreign military financing is usually given out in grants, free money that they don't have to pay back. And China hawks are pretty upset that they're just getting loans. So I think we're going to see an effort in 2023 with the House controlled by Republicans who are going to be more hawkish on China. They might try to get more aid to Taiwan, in different ways throughout the year. So, and besides funding Taiwan's arms purchases, the NDAA also calls for an increase in U.S. Taiwanese military cooperation. And as the U.S. has been increasing cooperation and increasing ties with Taiwan in recent years, Chinese officials have been warning that such support could lead to war. And Xi Jinping told President Biden when they recently met in Indonesia that Taiwan is a red line that the U.S. must never cross. So it's a huge deal for China, everything that's happening here. All right, the next article here, this is actually from Politico, and this is about Biden's trade policy. And it is titled A Sea Change. Biden reverses decades of Chinese trade policy. And the main point of this article is just how hardline Biden's trade policies on China have been. So after decades of U.S. effort to engage China with the prospect of greater development through trade, the era of cooperation is coming to a screeching halt. The White House and Congress are quietly reshaping the American economic relationship with the world's second largest economic power, enacting a strategy to limit China's technological development that breaks with decades of federal policy and represents the most aggressive American action yet to curtail Beijing's economic and military rise. So it's just such a major change. And the new federal rules, executive orders, and pending legislation aimed at China's high-tech sectors, which began this fall and will continue in 2023, are the culmination of years of debate spanning 3 administrations. Taken together, they represent an escalation of Trump's tariffs and trade disputes against Beijing that could ultimately do more to slow Chinese technological and economic development and divide the two economies than anything that Trump did while he was in office. So there's more details in the article here. It's pretty long, but I just wanted to, I want to drive home that how hardline Biden's policies are. And, just the fact, they're saying that the era of cooperation has come to a screeching halt between the U.S. and China. So this with the backdrop of the increasing military tensions. I mean, the economic relationship between the U.S. and China is always a thing that would prevent war, but now that's changing. And again, it's going to take a lot for the U.S. and Chinese economies to, decouple, but it seems like we're really headed in that direction. All right. So the next article we have here, another U.S. airstrike in Somalia. So U.S. Africa Command, they said in a press release that they conducted an airstrike in Somalia on December 23rd against al-Shabaab, marking the third known U.S. strike in the country this month. So AFRICOM said that the strike was launched in support of the Mogadishu-based government and that it targeted an area about 150 miles northeast of Mogadishu, the Somali capital. So it was on in the coastal region. So the U.S. backed, AFRICOM claimed in its initial assessment that 6 al-Shabaab fighters were killed in the strikes and that no civilians were harmed. Always have to point out that the Pentagon is known for undercounting civilian casualties in Somalia, and there's little accountability as there's virtually no media coverage of the U.S. war against al-Shabaab. Just a quick search. I got this from an AFRICOM press release. I didn't do a very thorough search, but I could usually find, in some of the military, like Military Times, a few other outlets will write up U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. I couldn't find a single article about this besides the AFRICOM press release. Again, I didn't search too thoroughly, but that's just how underreported this war is. And this also applies to media in Somalia. The Mogadishu-based government, I would call them the Mogadishu-based government because they don't control the whole country. I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is, but a good portion of the country is not controlled by this government, and this is the U.S.-backed government. But they have strict rules for media, and so does al-Shabaab. From what I understand, people that live in al-Shabaab-controlled areas can't have cell phones, so you're not going to get videos, on Twitter or whatever of like an aftermath of a U.S. airstrike. You're not going to see that. And then on the other side of it, the U.S.-backed government is very strict. Somali journalists just said that the government has enacted a new rule that requires them to submit content for approval. And 4 journalists have been arrested for their coverage of an al-Shabaab attack, that they covered this attack, I guess, without running it by the government. So that means, this government isn't going to want it getting out that U.S. drone strikes are hitting villages and killing civilians. No, they're not going to want to put that out there. So it's just going to be really hard to know what's going on. And so the Somali government, they've launched a pretty major offensive against al-Shabaab for a few months now. There's been a lot of fighting, and they've enlisted the help of local militias. And the Somali journalists who were arrested, they covered an al-Shabaab attack on rural villages in central Somalia that followed the withdrawal of one of these militias. And apparently there were some issues. They're saying they weren't getting paid by the Somali government. So I guess the government didn't want this story getting out, maybe because it's a little embarrassing that they can't control these militias. I don't know. Who knows? But again, it's just another example of the media blackout of these U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. And AFRICOM also said that it launched airstrikes on December 14th and December 17th in Somalia. So that's 3 this month. And that's just what we know. That's just what AFRICOM is telling us. There's also probably CIA drone strikes going on. It just could be a lot more than we're aware of. All right, so the last article in the news section is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. North Korean drones penetrate South Korean airspace. So 5 North Korean drones crossed into South Korea, including one that flew near the capital, Seoul. South Korea responded by scrambling jets as well as attack helicopters and attempted to shoot down the drones. And the drones sent by Pyongyang, they crossed into Seoul's airspace, where they measured about 2 meters long. And according to South Korean defense officials, so they measured about 2 meters long, and that's according to South Korean defense officials. And South Korea failed in its attempts to down the drone, and South Korea's defense agency believes that one drone returned to North Korean territory and is unsure about the fate of the other 4. And it looks like South Korea scrambled several jets and helicopters, including one light attack aircraft that crashed in this incident. So this is just another example of how high tensions are. And the last time that North Korea sent drones into South Korean airspace was in 2017. At that time, tensions between Washington and Pyongyang were exceptionally high. That was around the time Trump threatened to use nukes against North Korea. However, in Trump's second term as president, not second term, sorry, second year as president, he engaged with Kim Jong Un in several rounds of talks. And while there weren't any concrete deals signed of that, it really did reduce tensions. Both the North and the South really rolled back their military activity, but that's all changed since Biden came in. It's increased, and North Korea has launched a record number of weapons tests. There's tons of US South Korean war games. Tensions are really high, and there's no sign that they're going to reduce anytime soon. So that's not good. But that's all the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ron Paul about these huge omnibus. So go read that. One from Ted Snyder about Zelensky's trip, analyzing his trip to the U.S. One from Jonathan Cook about how Netanyahu handed Ben-Gvir the gun to start an annexation war. And this is about this government that Netanyahu has formed that's very extremist, settlers, and there could be much more violence in the West Bank. A third intifada could be sparked from this because there's already been a lot of violence in the West Bank over this past year. It's really soared. And if with these guys coming in, if they start really demolishing houses, it's just not going to be good news. One from Trita Parsi about over at MSNBC, I think, about while MBS undermines America, Joe Biden has his back on Yemen. And it's about the White House efforts to kill that war powers resolution that would have ended U.S. support for the war. And then the spotlight is from Eli Clifton over at Responsible Statecraft about how Twitter hid U.S. military psyops from the public, about that collusion between Twitter and the U.S. military on CENTCOM psyops. But that's everything. That was a lot of stuff. I hope I didn't run through too much information too quickly there. But, I did take a few days off. But anyway, support the show at antiwar.com/donate. So the year is almost over. And if you give us a donation now, they're all tax. They're all tax deductible. So you could write it off on your tax return. And this is the last week that you could do that for your 2022 tax return. So go give us a nice donation. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Share it around. Tell your friends. All that. That's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. It's probably going to be a little slower this week because now New Year's is coming up. Today was just jam-packed again because kind of the stuff that built up. But we'll see how the week goes. But anyway, that's it. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.